would like to. Oh, it's kind of doing something. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody at Gothica for inviting me uh, along. And also, I should say, or should apologize in advance, as I don't do these kind of things very often, so this might be a little bit creaky around the sides. And also, I would say that I do do stammer, so you know what that is when that happens. Okay, so um, um, today I will talk about future folk horror. But before we get into that bit, it's probably worthwhile going over actually what folk horror is. Folk horror is an amalgam of ideas and tropes that we bring together under the heading of folk horror. But actually, they quite often are shared amongst many other categories and genres as well. Folk horror itself has actually been around since there was indigenous law for new belief systems to displace, though it's only received academic attention as such relatively recently. And a good point to put as a starting place for that is Adam Schofield's book Folk Horror: Our Strange and Things Dreadful from 2017. And there's lots of other bits you can point to towards that, but it makes it a kind of nice shortcut to start there. Looking at that book, coming out of Scoville's work around filming locations, his conception of what folk horror is or was is very much about place and dislocation of places and those that live there being out of step with the modern world. And the tropes that he identified as being key to folk horror reflect this. First slide, please. So the four tropes, or what he called the folk horror chain, are the landscape, an isolated location, skewed religious beliefs, and some form of summoning or event due to those beliefs. So Scoville actually also identified three seminal films in relation to this, although they were kind of picked up as well before that, which called the unholy Trinity. And that is The Witchfinder General from 1968, Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971, and The Wicker Man from 1973, which all feature some of those tropes. Sorry, so on the screen. These three films and kind of what came out of them can be problematic for multiple reasons. Not least, it kind of produced the impression that folk horror is oddly British and was born, hyphens either side of that, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Although Scoville himself noted that it was a much wider phenomenon. But the Britishness and locational focus influenced the nature of the essential tropes or chain of folk horror mentioned above. Um, so, looking at looking at it now from the perspective of 2024 and post Keela Janice's documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, a history of folk horror, it's obvious that although Britain of the late 60s, early 70s was important to the initial identification of folk horror, is actually a far wider phenomenon. And I think we can add some further detail to the links of that first chain. So using the original chain as a framework, it can be embellished with the following. Slide 2, please. So with the landscape, we can add on that it's usually seen as being rural woodlands, but can also be any natural environment that does not have a substantial human population. And the isolated location, which kind of naturally follows on from the idea of landscape, but that can also imply non-rural spaces, such as empty, abandoned buildings, basements, hidden rooms, tunnels, ships at sea, submarines, spacecraft, planes, lighthouses, and imagined dream spaces. And there is also with these, you can add a lot of the what you would call man-made locations are often infected with some kind of decay, or they are under threat from a natural environment outside of it. So slide 3, please. Moving on to the next link. So here, the skewed beliefs, which is kind of a minority religious or ideological belief that is often linked to the landscape or the environment and in temporal opposition to the beliefs of the present. And that kind of plays up more as we go along. So within that, that are linked to that skewed beliefs, there are cults or communities of followers who are often more intimately connected to the environment location, and the use of folklore, actual or diegetic, so the folkloresque, and that often involves a ritual of some kind and or a shrine, a monument, or objects are getting more and more important within this, that is or are central to the law and or ritual. So slide 4, please. So with that, the last link, the summoning and event. So you have a summoning of some kind in relation to the skewed beliefs. This can be an entity, such as god, demon, or spirit, and or an event. This is often a sacrifice, individual or collective, and or an entity moving from one body to another, and or something more catastrophic in relation to either the community or the wider environment planet. However, the summoning does not necessarily need to be the culmination of the narrative and can occur earlier. And that is actually one of the examples we will look at later. And with this, which kind of links back to a couple of the notes in the earlier links, is that all of the above are linked to ecological or environmental well-being or return, that also suggests an improved relationship between humankind and nature or the modern world and in indigenous law. And this is much more of a feature of more recent folk horror things, but you can also see that working out in much earlier versions, where quite often it contains the idea of those with skewed beliefs are actually more in tune with the environment around them, and it's us, the modern world, coming in who are out of tune, that actually cause all of the problems. So while these are all embellishments to Scoville's original chain, it's important to add a new link that was inherently present in the original 4, and its centrality to folk horror was not made as explicit as it should be. That is bringing out that idea of dislocation. And actually, Dawn Keatley, in her a great little new book on folklore Gothic, brings up the idea of like temporal anachronism, and that's very important. So the first 3 links, landscape, isolated location, and skewed beliefs, are all about dislocation, whether it is geographically or ideologically. It is a form of temporal dislocation from the world around them, the rural from the urban, the isolated from the crowded, and the folklore / pagan from the Christian. Although it tends to be Christian in a lot of these, it obviously can be whatever the majority belief is. In Scoville's chain, this is predominantly seen as a form of looking back, whether it's the contemporary location of 1970s Scotland, looking back to the pagan beliefs of Summerisle, or the 18th century modern Britain, looking back to earth magics and Satanism, blood on Satan's claw. This last is of particular note, as it suggests that the looking back can take place between any 2 points, whether in the present, the past, or even the future. This is a point picked up, as mentioned, by Dawn in her Folklore Gothic, where she identifies a key trope of folk horror as being the involvement of a temporal anachronism. So using all that, we can add a new folk horror link as follows, as is slide 5. So the narrative contains a temporal anachronism. This can be between the present and the past. A representative of the present goes to a location, community that represents the past, and all the beliefs held there are an embodiment of the past. Or between the present and the future. Here, the future can be a remote location with skewed beliefs that cause a summoning event in the present, or the present in relation to the future as a remote location with skewed beliefs that causes a summoning in the future. Excuse me, switch over sheets. Okay, so that brings us to what future folk horror is or might be. So coming from the above then is the possibility of configuring some kind of future folk horror which contains some or all of the tropes identified previously, along with a temporal dislocation involving the future in some way. There is a sense here that the future can also involve futuristic versions of humanity that occur in the present. So with that, I'm kind of thinking of obviously of something like Wells's War of the Worlds, where the Martians are kind of envisioned as being a future version of humanity. So beginning from this point, there are two main types of future folk horror. The first is narratives that are set in the future that look back to the diegetic past, which actually could be our present, and the second one is narratives set in the present that look forward to the diegetic future. So the first type one, the first of these is common in apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic texts, as seen in films like Stateland 2, Girl with All the Gifts, Cargo kind of squeaks in, and ends, right? All of these are set in future versions of the world, and all have a focus on landscape and the effects of isolation, with minority belief systems that are either a return to the bad ideas that cause the apocalypse, and or a return to much earlier ideas around indigenous law and or earth magics, a bit of a vague one there. Of note in these narratives is that the summoning or event at the end is not necessarily a is not necessarily a negative one, and although it does often signal the end of the modern world. Alongside these are more obviously futuristic narratives that are set in outer space or on alien worlds, such as narratives like Ghosts on Mars, where there is a summoning of the spirits of past indigenous Martians. Avatar, a return to its own law nature spirits, and the recent, I think it's a Chinese series or Korean series, Silent Sea, where there's the discovery of indigenous lunar inhabitants. Again, all of these are based around the importance of landscape, a sense of isolation, and different belief systems. The modern world in all these instances is embodied by humanity, which itself has a skewed belief system, often involving the exploitation of the natural habitat for money, and where the summoning event involves the appearance of the indigenous population and or some form of planetary ecological spirit. For a closer look at how this works in practice, I want to look at a favorite film of mine, Event Horizon, from 1997. So it's actually quite old for saying it's new, but yeah. So the film is set in 2047, which is getting much nearer than it was, where a rescue ship, the Lewis and Clark, is sent out to Neptune to find a spaceship, the Event Horizon, that had vanished 7 years earlier and has just reappeared. Next slide, please. There we go. So the landscape here is out to space, a vast inhuman silent expanse within which now sits the Event Horizon in perfect isolation. You can just about see the little cross thing there, which is the ship. So unlike the Lewis and Clark, the Event Horizon is created by the environment around it, which will become more apparent as the film goes on, and not just the vacuum of space around it, but the expanse of the multi-dimensional universe itself. So the Event Horizon is an embodiment of temporal dislocation, as it is simultaneously in but not of the world. And we can kind of see how that works as that as the plot goes on. The drive within the ship acts as a portal to other dimensions, but also works like a standing stone, and that's important, that has a shrine constructed around it and even a pathway leading to it. So next slide, please. And here we go. So the crew, so you can see the standing stone, the shrine, the pathway leads to the shrine, and the green that actually lines the shrine on the other side. So the crew of the Lewis and Clark then act as the outsiders from the modern world, the present day of the narrative, who have entered an isolated location knowing nothing of the environmental effects that have shaped it or the law of the objects and beliefs that govern it, except that is for Weir, who we actually see in like the green lower down, played by Sam Neill, who designed the ship and is somehow connected to it. The curious thing about the gravity drive, and that is the big like metal thistle head over on the far left. And the interesting thing about the gravity drive and the air around it is that although it's constructed from metal, it has a curiously organic and natural, if spiky, feel to it, and that was in the bit of reading I put up before the talk. So the standing stone of the drive looks like a huge thistle head, and the pathway to it is very reminiscent of a pathway overgrown with thorny bushes. Indeed, there's that kind of thorny bush idea from Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty. So more so, the green, green is a very dominant color throughout the film. There's lots of other slides that I like could have put up with this, and is seen to striking effect in the construction of the shrine around the drive. Behind the panels or metal scales that line the shrine are banks of computers, and when Weir goes we see them as this bright green veins, almost some kind of life force that then feeds the drive itself. So the impression one gets is that of a is a is of a forest, at the middle of which is a standing stone of the drive, sitting in its shrine that's constructed for the faithful. Not unlike films such as In the Tall Grass or even Ritual. The skewed beliefs and the community that is shaped by them becomes increasingly apparent as the narrative unfolds. There are fleeting visions and nightmares which soon begin to have an effect on the crew of the Lewis and Clark, with Weir in particular becoming something of a high priest, converting the modern unbelievers to the reality of their ancient beliefs. Page over. Oh, that's that one. So this builds until the climax or summoning of the film, where it is revealed that the standing stone of the drive is in fact a portal to another dimension, which is actually hell. So there's no obvious suggestion of Satan or the devil himself here, unlike that scene in Blood on Satan's Claw, which actually uses a very similar theme throughout, and a religion that is old as humanity itself. As the past engulfs the future present of 2047, two of the crew escape in the forward section of the event horizon. Seemingly, they are slowly making their way back to Earth, unaware that they have taken the old religion back there with them. And this is one of those that starts that idea that future folk horror is not just content about keeping its own little bit of the world safe, but actually wants to infect the rest. Right, so this brings us to type 2 of future folk horror, and this is about those that are set in our present now, or the present of the narrative, that look forward to the future. These often show our present day as being the isolated location of skewed beliefs, and the summoning event at the end can suggest that this is about to change forever. So examples of this can be seen in films like Annihilation, the series Bodies, and to some extent, although we've only seen the first part, the three-body problem. In some, three-body problem, and in some ways, even parts of the Terminator series. But here I want to look at the film Arrival. So in some ways, Annihilation would have actually fitted in better, as they do very similar things, and it's more obviously horror, but I really like Arrival, and I think it talks to a different kind of horror, kind of like cosmic horror, that occurs in cosmic horror in terms of a clash of human and universal scale. And that's something that we can talk about later in questions or something. So anyway, next slide, please. So here we go. The Arrival is all about landscape and isolation, with the film's director Denis Villeneuve prioritizing wide shots of the landscape and creating voluminous space even in crowded areas by focusing very tightly on foreground characters, so they become isolated from the other figures around them. Indeed, the main character, Louise Banks, who actually, this would be in the silhouetted figure in the top one, and the crouching figure in the middle one. Louise Banks, played by Amy Adams, seems to exist in a state of constant isolation. However, when the film begins, we see her with her baby daughter, and it is only her that Banks seems properly connected to, though the relationship also occurs in a landscape, which is where Banks lives. A lot of the early pictures of Banks with her daughter, they're very much to do with occurring in the landscape that is just those two. So the film is also about language, and Banks describes it as many things: the building block of civilization, a tool, but also a weapon to describe how we experience the world, and even language itself. Indeed, language then constructs how we think, how we make stories, how we create the law of who we are, who we were, and who we will be. So as the film begins, we assume that it begins in the past, and that we see Banks's daughter growing up to be a teenager before dying of cancer, and bringing us to what seems to be the present day of the film, where Banks is now a university lecturer teaching translation. But by the conclusion of the film, we begin to realize that this might not be the case, and that the summoning event that occurs at the narrative's end might have already happened before the film began. So one day while Banks is teaching, 12 alien ships arrive and position themselves at various locations around the world. And Banks, as a linguist, and Ian Donnelly, Jeremy Renner, as a physicist, are chosen by the US government to help communicate with one of the ships that landed in Montana. And as they are both flown there by helicopter, we see the alien ship floating above the landscape like a giant standing stone, and that's the lower right hand image there. Slide 9, please. So the stone, as with Event Horizon, is a portal to an alien world, though here it is not in the middle of a shrine, but rather the shrine is actually in the middle of the stone. The pathway to the shrine, you can see it on the top left, within which the community with skewed beliefs, the aliens themselves, is equally as disorientating as that in Event Horizon, and is entered through a hole in the bottom of the ship. And although it extends vertically into the heart of the ship, its gravity is such that after a certain distance, you can walk horizontally along its walls. At the end of the pathway is the shrine, the big white screen, where the community get, 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 gathers. That is the two aliens, but it is separated from the Earth's atmosphere by a glass-like screen, so that the modern world and the future world remain separated. It becomes apparent that the aliens are connected to the future in some way, as they know about events that will occur in 3,000 years' time. The aliens themselves are called, at least in the film, are called heptapods, and look something like large hanging squids that float in the cloud-like atmosphere within the craft. Indeed, clouds kind of play a big part within the film, as the ship itself floats in clouds. So the overall effect is of a mist-laden forest with the Cthulhu scene-like creatures appearing out of the gloom, making noises like wails or or elephants, consequently configuring them as related to nature, but something more universal than just the nature from Earth. Banks, as a representative of the modern world, quickly establishes a connection to the community via visual language, which takes the form of esoteric symbols that disperse and reform. Indeed, language that is stories and or lore rather than just simply words. More so, the more that Banks learns of the lore of the community, the more she becomes part of it, leading to the summoning event which provides the conclusion / start of the film. As the aliens try to communicate with the humans, they use the word weapon rather than gift, which causes world leaders to panic, especially the Chinese. In a bid to defuse things, Banks and Donnelly go back into the alien ship, and Banks is suddenly able to talk to the aliens by manipulating the ink that they write with. Like them, she is now aware of future events and uses this knowledge to diffuse the situation in the present. She has been changed by the alien language lore, so that now she simultaneously lives in the past, present, and future. The film ends as the camp around the standing stone of the spaceship disperses, and Dolly tells Banks that he loves her, and they decide to have a child together. This is the child we saw Banks with at the start of the film, which she already knows will die of cancer as a teenager. Indeed, it was her telling Donnelly of this event while the child is still a baby that causes him to leave, as he cannot cope with the news. Knowing all of this, Banks still says yes. It is unclear at film's end just what the ramifications for humanity are, though it is likely that Banks is not the only human to have been changed by contact with the alien lore. Not unlike the end of Annihilation, where there is a sense that things will change further and forever. And a feature of more recent folk horror texts is that the encounter with lore of the past and or the future is more likely to change the nature of the global present and change it forever. And that's it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think we're seeing lots of virtual claps going on, and that was absolutely fantastic. Such a good range of visual text for us there. And yeah,